Hello, hello. I'm coming at you live from my bedroom. I'm currently in the process of sorting out because I'm getting a new desk to go here, and it's arriving tomorrow. So, of course, in my ADHD way of preparing for something, rather than just clearing a space, I've decided to pull everything out of every cupboard and sort through it all. Because why not? Because I have time for that shit. Anyway, how are you all? Good evening. It's the 16th of May, 2023. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Heidi Mavir. I'm the founder of EOTAS Matters and the author of the bestseller Your Child Is Not Broken, available on Amazon and all good bookshops, published by Bluebird Books for Life. Drop me a hey if you're watching live. I've been promising this since this morning and, since last night actually, and I've only just got round to doing it. So we'll see how many people jump on live with me. And I'd love to know what your thoughts are on this as well. So I said I would watch and then share some thoughts on the Panorama programme that aired last night on BBC. The Panorama programme was called ADHD Private Clinics or something like that. And it was an expose of the crisis, or as they called it, the scandal in private ADHD clinics in the UK right now. So for those who didn't watch it, basically the presenter, hello Facebook user, if you're getting a Facebook user, you need to go up to the top and give StreamYard your permission to see, so I can see your name, so I can see who it is. So basically the basic premise of the program was that the presenter had been contacted by someone whose daughter had been diagnosed privately with ADHD, and they had highlighted that their diagnostic appointment took less than 30 minutes and then they were prescribed medication. Now, not for a second am I saying that that is good practice. It absolutely is not at all. And we know that the NICE guidelines say you should be seen by two professionals, one of whom should be a psychiatrist, and that then you should have a titration period for your medication. But it kind of, the thing that really bothered me about the program more than anything else was the narrative around, isn't it terrible that private clinics are misdiagnosing our people, basically. And I found it really problematic for a number of reasons. The first thing I found quite problematic was that the presenter went to see an NHS diagnostician. Yes, they should absolutely all be gold standard. What I feel like they were doing in the narrative was they weren't saying what they should have been saying, which is it's an absolute scandal that you have to wait 5 years for an NHS diagnosis for ADHD, and you can't secure medication for ADHD without an ADHD diagnosis, and it takes 5 years. So many of us are having to go private. Isn't it awful that this frontline service is so underfunded and under-resourced that we all have to go private and pay for it? That's what I feel the angle should have been. Look how much in crisis that NHS are, that people with a diagnosable, treatable condition are not able to get diagnosed and instead have to go privately. That could have been one angle, okay? But it wasn't. The angle was, look at all these private clinics diagnosing people who are not really ADHD. That's how it was sold in. Yeah, like Linda says, I felt like the narrative was all these people don't have ADHD because they have had a private assessment. And that's what I felt it was like as well. The presenter, who I would add in the opening titles, was stimming and had nails like bitten down to the quick. And was wearing a beanie and a very colourful top. Like, if I was going to take a punt at whether he was one of ours or not, I'd probably take a punt of maybe, probably, possibly. I'm not a diagnostician. But he saw 3 different diagnosticians. The first one he saw was an NHS. It's actually the lead of the Leeds NHS ADHD service. Now, I did Google this person. Plus he was super ADHD. Well, yeah. The person who was interviewed at the beginning of the program was the lead of the ADHD service in Leeds. He's actually only been in post since November. So I don't know when this was filmed, but he does also have a private practice, a private autism practice. It's not an ADHD practice, but it is a private autism practice. And he was basically saying that he is very concerned about the number of people who are pursuing private diagnoses, and that he doesn't think that the private diagnoses that are being given are rigorous enough. And he did an assessment with the chap who was the presenter, a 3-hour assessment, and at the end of it said, I'm not going to diagnose you with ADHD. Didn't say you don't have ADHD, said I'm not going to diagnose you with ADHD. And the reason I'm not going to diagnose you with ADHD is because there is not sufficient evidence that this has an impact on your day-to-day life. So whilst you might demonstrate traits, this is not having a significant impact on your day-to-day life. Ergo, I would not diagnose because I wouldn't recommend medication. And off he potted. Thing is, they did that. They went to the NHS clinician. They jumped a 5-year chuffing waiting list for a 3-hour appointment with a very senior clinician who probably doesn't do much diagnosing day to day. I would doubt he does at all. And went through a full 3-hour assessment on the understanding that they were making a program about private clinics, and they wanted to show that private clinics are not the standard of NHS. So, of course, he was going to get a thorough assessment, and probably, of course, he was not going to get a diagnosis. That's what a cynic would say. Kim, yes, I had to pay for my daughter. It's disgusting. We should be able to claim it back from the NHS. Yeah. I found it really triggering and diminishing to people who have struggled or may struggle. Yeah, same. Glad it wasn't just my son and I was thinking that. Yeah. Oh, it's Kate. Hey, Kate. I think it's Kate. No, it's not Kate. It's someone responding to Kate. Anyway. So then he went to a private practice. He went to 2 other private practices. I can't remember one of them. He went to a private practice who gave him a pretty shonky diagnosis process, whereby he was assessed by a psychologist, and then he saw a psychiatrist, and it didn't look very thorough. I've got to be honest, it didn't. And then he went to ADHD 360, who are part of the Right to Choose offer through the NHS, who again was not, well, they said it wasn't particularly robust, but actually it sounded like they'd done the questionnaire that you do in advance. And then I think the appointment was about an hour, and then another appointment with a psychiatrist. So a bit more robust, but certainly the first one didn't seem like it was particularly robust. But then the narrative was this, right? I took some notes. So one of the things, they saw a GP, right? A GP. And they interviewed the GP and said, you know, would you diagnose people with ADHD after a half an hour assessment? And the GP was like, no. First off, GPs can't diagnose ADHD, and they can't prescribe medication. That's the whole point. You have to be seen according to the guidelines, and in line with the DSM-5, you have to be assessed by 2 professionals, one of whom should be a psychiatrist, and you've got to go through titration for medication. So asking a GP, would you diagnose, would you prescribe for a person who's been, you know, or would you diagnose? No, they wouldn't, because that's not the process in the UK. You can't just go to a GP and say, I've had an ADHD diagnosis, I'd like some drugs, please. That's not the way that works. He went over cover for the NHS assessment and then went undercover for private diagnoses, which is not, like, of course he was going to get a thorough 3-hour assessment with the NHS when he's there going, I want to see what the NHS gold standard is like. If he'd gone to those private clinics and said, I want to see your best diagnostic experience, of course, it's like having Ofsted in, right? So it's not comparable. One of the things that was said by someone who had previously worked in one of the private clinics was, seldom do people get a diagnosis. Seldom people don't get a diagnosis when they go private, right? They were basically saying that everyone that goes for a private diagnosis gets a diagnosis. And I think someone quoted between 90 and 95% of people who go for a private assessment get a diagnosis. Here's the thing, though. You don't spend money on a private diagnosis if you're not pretty sure that you're ADHD. So you're not going to have a fuck ton of people who are not ADHD pitching up for an ADHD assessment and paying for it privately. That's not going to happen. So of course the levels of diagnosis are going to be high. Of course they are. That's like saying, you know, 90% of people who see a private dentist need dental treatment, you know? So that annoyed me. But what I really found troubling was that the conversation was all about, look at all these people getting private diagnoses. They're not ADHD. Look at all these people getting these powerful, dangerous drugs. They're not ADHD. Look at all these people who are wasting, wasting their resources and being taken advantage of and who are vulnerable. They're not ADHD. When actually the conversation should have been, what about exposing the lack of speed or efficacy in the NHS route to diagnosis? Don't criticize the use of private clinics when you can't get seen on the NHS. Where's the conversation about that? Where's the conversation about the lack of care for all of our undiagnosed and unidentified ADHDers? All that you've done there is you've written a narrative that says if you've got a private diagnosis of ADHD, you're probably not ADHD. So dangerous, so invalidating for all of us who have had to go down this route. So let's see what people are saying. We had to wait 8 years and the assessors called us lucky. Yeah. Surely they could have had 3 assessments with 3 different NHS teams to make a better comparison. Yeah, or just like, one of the things that I think it really showed is that what we know this about ADHD and autism assessments is that they are very much dependent on the diagnostician. And there's a lot of room for interpretation by the diagnostician. It's not like a cookie cutter. Like you'll be seen by one team, you'll be seen by another team, and you might get a totally different outcome. It's very much the outcome is very much based in the bias of the diagnostician ultimately, and what their experience is and how they view neurodivergence and how they view disability, what their quotas are, whether they're trying to reduce the number of people diagnosed, whether they're trying to reduce the cost on the local CCG. Yeah, it would have been a very short program if the NHS diagnosed it. It wouldn't fit his narrative. This is true. This is true. But it could equally have been just as good though, Melanie. Like he could have been diagnosed on the NHS, and then you could have compared it to the private assessments, and then you could have said, isn't it a shame that more people can't access good quality diagnostic services through the NHS? It's quite hypocritical as many private practitioners previously practiced in the NHS and ADHD as a right to choose for the NHS. True. There we go. That's who they were. Harley Psychiatrists and ADHD 360. They also did this thing with Harley Psychiatrists where they went and knocked on the door and were like, oh, they're not really here, like some kind of like watchdog arrangement like that. It's not unusual for a practice. I'm not saying that they're a great practice, by the way, but it's not unusual for a private practice to have a registered address, particularly a Harley Street address if they're a medical practice. That's not unusual. Most people would pay hundreds or thousands for a diagnosis. I'm pretty sure they're going to get the diagnosis as they probably thoroughly researched it themselves. They just don't want to wait 5 years. So saying, was there anyone not diagnosed is ridiculous. Agreed. I've been waiting for a year for ASD testing to find out yesterday the GP didn't even bother to send in the referral. Fucking hell. I find it interesting how there's so much overloaded, so much how overloaded the NHS is now. The propaganda is to shun private diagnosis. What else are we actually meant to do? Yeah. I chose not to watch because I thought I'd find it triggering. I mean, yes, but I felt like I had to. It was half an hour's program. Like you can't cover a topic as complex as this in half an hour. But I thought it highlighted that there are certain companies out there who are taking advantage of people who are desperate for answers. I agree. And all because the NHS is underfunding and failing to meet demand. Do you feel like that was communicated, Stephanie? Like, I agree that the first part was communicated. I agree that there was definitely the narrative was some of these shonky clinics. That was accurate. And I think there are some shonky clinics. And I think there are some overpriced private practices. I also think there are some great private practices. So yeah, I'm wondering if you think that second part, because the NHS is underfunded and failing to meet demand, I wonder if that was actually addressing the problem, because I didn't feel like it was. Before spending of thousands, you research. True. You agree with the point about the percentages of diagnoses. Like most private practices, teeth, plastic surgery, etc., you should use due diligence to make sure you aren't getting a shit service. True. How invalidating for so many people. Was the narrative ADHD is so woke and trendy and anyone can get a diagnosis? There was an element of that. There was talk of a flood of referrals. The GP that was interviewed was talking about how she would usually see, I think she said maybe 20 or 30 referrals, and now it's hundreds, people self-referring. There was no conversation about what the cause of that was. There was no... but the narrative that followed was loads of people are pitching into GP services. They're not getting seen on the NHS. If they were, they wouldn't get diagnosed. They're going private. They're getting diagnosed. They're getting really dangerous drugs. Oh my God, we're all doomed. That's how I read it. I might be wrong. Let's get on Panorama for a follow-up. Also, the timing of the programme, straight after the One Show and straight before Rav and his Scam Watchdog show, they knew the audience. Truth, right? Right? Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that, Linda. That's very true. I just got diagnosed in April by Psychiatry UK after reading your book, Your Child Is Not Broken. I have 2 teenage boys with ADHD, significant issues, both have an EHCP. Life has been tough dealing with the stigma around ADHD. I always knew I was different. Now I know I'm the same as my children. After watching this documentary, my self-doubt was through the roof. I felt so triggered, I actually messaged Adult ADHD UK, who were really supportive. Right. Let's not forget that ADHDers have extreme rejection sensitivity, and many of us have masked and gaslit ourselves for decades. And then we see a program like that and we're back in the place of, am I really ADHD? Maybe I'm just lazy. Maybe I'm just a useless human. Maybe people were right about me all along. You know, like it's not responsible to be putting those of us who are vulnerable in a position where we're exposed to potentially more harm. Can you imagine? I'm sure this has happened today. There are people who have gone into offices today who are diagnosed as ADHD, and there's been water cooler chatter about, oh, did you see that program about ADHD last night? Oh my God, all these people getting ADHD diagnoses and it's not even a real thing. I can imagine that. Helen, my youngest son has been referred to CAMS, 3-year wait at the minimum. He's already nearly 8. There's no wonder so many go private. Would they be saying the same for people who have cancer who are waiting for NHS treatment who have to go private? Yeah. Compare the Sam Thompson experience with his private ADHD assessment on his documentary. Haven't seen that. The underfunding of the NHS does not fit the BBC new Tory agenda. Whew! Oh, she said it. I assume he was undercover for the private assessments, but then openly saying he was investigating the NHS condition and unfair comparison. That's exactly what he did. That's exactly what happened. In our area, almost every private clinic is staffed by professionals who also work part-time in diagnostic roles with the NHS. That's true. That's true for our area too. I haven't watched. I've heard enough about it. I went with ADHD 360, but was pushed to go private by the NHS. I wouldn't have spent that much money as I wasn't sure I'm ADHD. I have a son diagnosed ADHD on the NHS. Shame our adult service is so corrupt. Getting a referral as an adult is an absolute nightmare. Until Right to Choose came in, I wouldn't even tell people to try. At least with Right to Choose, you have more of an option, but it's very difficult. The flood is all misdiagnosed adult women who are now on TikTok and realize their depression is actually ADHD. I mean, I'm laughing because it's funny, because it's true. Because there's hundreds waiting on the NHS, 700 to 800 kids on the list in Warrington alone. Whew. I should add, I would not rate ADHD 360 for aftercare at all. Okay. I watched it and thought the psychologist looked beyond bored. I wouldn't have continued private or NHS. Yeah, the person that was on the video call, I mean, I think it's unfortunate that they picked someone who looked like a webcam girl. But she did look bored. And that's not a judgment on webcam girls. I just think that they were quite clever in their editing. I want to watch as I was diagnosed last Wednesday, but I'm scared to. Congratulations. Plus, I don't want to wind myself up. They're a dodge private practice for any condition, so why pick on ADHD? Because they have failed 30 plus age people all these years with misdiagnosis and they're just blaming mental health. Where can we complain? It's so wrong these days that a program can be made with our money. It's just so wrong that they pick on people who are already discriminated against so much, and I hate it. Oh, Hayley, I'm really sorry. It is on iPlayer. You can also lodge a formal complaint. There is I think there's I'll find a link. I think she has ADHD. The diagnostician. Oh yeah, definitely. It's a 30-minute program, and in 6 months' time, I'd be surprised if anyone will remember it. There's been a few documentaries about abuse in residential clinics, and nothing happens to make needed changes. Lots of hand-wringing, but no tangible action. Yeah, I think you're probably right there. Yeah. I wouldn't bother watching it. It was the equivalent of reading The Sun or the Daily Mail. I agree. It wasn't great telly. It wasn't great investigative journalism. It didn't really say anything of any value, but I do think it will cause harm. I do think people who are Sun readers or Daily Mail readers who don't know any better, who get most of their education from Panorama and the like, will now be in a position where they further discriminate against ADHD people. And I was really sad. There was a woman who had been diagnosed by the practice in Harley Street, I think, who had a 30-minute diagnosis and had felt like she hadn't had a decent experience, which I can totally understand, and had been diagnosed with ADHD meds. And I wasn't really watching properly, but I think that it hadn't been successful for her. And she was really upset when he said that his diagnosis with the NHS had been 3 hours, and she cried and said, that's what I wanted. And she was clearly one of ours, like she had never been seen by an NHS clinician. And I just felt so like, is this going to mean that people don't pursue a diagnosis because they think that there's no value in private practices? Because that would be awful. There's definitely something about regulating the private industry better. There's definitely something about reducing waiting lists. There's definitely something about better education within GP surgeries and, better early intervention for people. But to be kind of like swiping across the whole private practice just feels like a miss for me. I also think the NHS are reluctant to look at the differing presentations of girls and women. Yep. Paperwork we have had through privately for my daughter is far more relevant and appropriate for her than our NHS experience with my other daughter. Yes. Yeah. Off topic, but I donated my first copy of our book to the library today. Oh, thanks. That's cool. Thank you. She was definitely one of ours. Perhaps she wanted the aftercare rather than the diagnosis and the answers. Yeah, I think there's that. Yeah. I'm also waiting for an autism assessment, and I've possibly got auditory processing disorder. It's going to cause a lot more harm. They will discriminate more. I've been told by a rheumatologist that I need a psychiatric help, not theirs. I suffer with pain since my bipolar meds were stopped and having COVID. Gosh, Hayley, that sounds like a lot. You've got a lot going on there, my love. Sadly, I fear this will cause further discrimination. Of course, there are poor clinicians, but that's true in the NHS too. Thinking of all the underdiagnosis of autistic assigned female at birth people. Yeah, for sure. Just, half an hour program, what are you going to do in half an hour? But I was so disappointed. Not surprised, just disappointed. And in the context of everything else that's going on at the moment, I'm just like, it's coming at us from every angle. We can't get a referral on the NHS because no one believes us, because we're not bouncing off walls and turning over chairs and tables. If we go private, we get told that our private diagnosis doesn't count. We get told that our kids' private diagnosis don't count, and they won't include them in their EHCPs. Just like, for God's sake. I think there would have been a lot of things not shown, like patient history. Yeah. It was clickbait for the boomers. Yeah. When my daughter was diagnosed with autism, she was suffering from anxiety, not in school, and the NHS still wouldn't prescribe meds. The only reason she got them was because she had 30 sessions of CBT therapy and it didn't work. Shock. CBT and autism don't mix. Yeah. Initially, I can't read all of this, I'm sorry. Initially, I was told 2-year wait for ADHD diagnosis. I feel very lucky that I was approached to take part in a randomized national study funded by the NHS. Trailing people that have bipolar taking ADHD medication, it was a grueling assessment and I came out with a diagnosis of ADHD combined type. Since then, however grateful I am, I feel really guilty as I know people have been waiting so long, like I've cheated a system. There is a reflection on those struggling on waiting lists. I can't read all of that. I'm glad you got your diagnosis. I don't think any of us begrudge you that. People will dismiss private diagnosis even more now. I already feel teachers, family, etc. don't believe my daughter really has ADHD. She had a private assessment, but clinician was doing NHS work as well. Yeah. Right to choose adult ADHD diagnosis, CAMS ADHD diagnosis, and community pediatrician ADHD diagnosis so far for 3 of my kids. Not really much difference between any of them, except one was virtual, but the report for the right to choose Psychiatry UK was way better. So you've experienced a CAMS diagnosis, a private ADHD diagnosis, and a community pediatrician diagnosis. Interesting. I read somewhere that his family and girlfriend filled in loads of forms beforehand. I wouldn't be surprised if the private ones were correct and he was ADHD and the NHS misdiagnosed. I mean, I've got no doubt that that's what happened. No doubt. I think this will give school and LA professionals more reason to refuse a child's private diagnosis. I wonder if they had more assessments, but only showed the ones that diagnosed. That's an interesting point, actually. I wonder. I doubt it, but I wonder. We've just been to tribunal for our EHCP, and one of the things that I appealed in the EHCP was that we have a private autism and ADHD diagnosis, and the local authority wouldn't include it in section B, which is the outline of need, and I had to go to tribunal to get it put in my EHCP. My son's EHCP. He's been diagnosed ADHD and autistic, and they wouldn't include it in his EHCP. Yes, private adults do the QB test. Yes, I think it's slightly different. You have someone, a close family member, do it rather than I think for children and young people, it's a teacher, isn't it, that does part of it as well. My GP wouldn't initially refer me for autism and ADHD diagnosis because I have depression and anxiety. Oh, who knew? You can't have both. My child's CAM worker is adamant I have ADHD and tried to find a way for me to be seen without the GP referring, but couldn't. I'm on the list now, but I still face a 2-year wait. If the referral had been done when I first asked, I would have been seen by now. My child with ADHD says I'm so bad they find me impossible to live with. Yep. I'm not saying yeah because I think you're impossible to live with. Totally. A head teacher within my locality is very vocal about not agreeing with parents seeking private diagnosis for their children. They judge parents hugely for it. We'll not get started on their view on parental requests for EHC needs assessment. No, let's not go down that rabbit hole. Sarah, I've only recently been diagnosed with ADHD and autism at the ripe old age of 50. Yay! And this has really sent me into a spiral. I'm so sorry. I just want to say to people who are diagnosed or self-identified or otherwise as neurodivergent ADHD or anything else, we believe you. We know you're not making it up. We don't think you're broken. We don't think that you're faulty. We don't think you're sorry. I lost my connection. I'm sorry that this is so hard and that you have to ride this out. And please know that you're not on your own. There are lots of us in this boat together. And yeah, it's shit. It's shit. And I'm really sorry it's shit. Our GP said, well, you can't mask ADHD, can you? Delaying referral. Yeah. So I'm going to call it a day there. So basically, abridged version of that is Panorama last night. What a pile of shite. Am I right? But yeah, just mainly a missed opportunity to really have the proper conversation about how stuffed our NHS is and how much we're being let down. Adults with ADHD are being let down. I'll make this last one. I don't understand this whole thing around everyone wants to be diagnosed or ADHD autistic. No, we just want validation. I don't know a single person who has pushed for an assessment when they aren't positive they're neurodivergent. Right, exactly. very few people who are not ADHD spend any time wondering whether they're ADHD or not. There's a complaint link on the BBC website. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to call it a night because I've got an author Q&A in 20 minutes and I need to go and have a cup of tea and get my shit together. So if you took part in my giveaway and you pre-ordered a copy of or ordered a copy of my new edition before the end of the first day when it was on sale, and you sent us a copy of your receipt, you will have received a Zoom link, and I will be live on Zoom with some of you lovely people at 7 o'clock this evening, I hope. But thank you for joining me. Please do feel free to share this out. If you're watching on replay, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. And yeah, if you have the spoons and you want to, then I would empower you to go and make a complaint to the BBC, because it was certainly not quality journalism, and I'd argue that it wasn't unbiased either. Okay, have an evening. I will see you soon. Take care. Bonsoir.